So how did I become a monotheist again and come back to believing in God? Or, as it says here on my number one, the Freemason term for God, which is my very favorite one, the supreme grand architect of the universe. And I'll tell you the story about how that happened, and then I'll end with actually a refutation of one of the most famous proofs of God by C.S. Lewis that convinced so many people, because that's actually wrong. But what happened for me is I grew up in the Church of the Brethren, rural Pennsylvania, lovely people, and believing in God as this kind of masculine authority figure, but loving, was just in the atmosphere at the time. The first break in my Christian armor was reading Strange in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein, and that polyamory was like, yes, this is how life is supposed to be, at least for me. And then I even did, after high school, did missionary work in Nepal with Youth with a Mission, which I am not proud of. Going and telling these people with a 5,000-year-old religion, they should really check out this 2,000-year-old religion. But luckily, we weren't very pushy about it, and even at the time, I knew something about this did not feel right, and I didn't really participate in that kind of way. And then I go to university, and that's where the atheism really started to kick in, just from all the reading. And then I worked in a lab for a while, and then went to India with my savings for a year with my kid sister. And that was a very intense trip, as you can imagine. I got mixed up with the Tibetan protest march that walked from Dharamshala down to the Delhi and up to the border. Some of the bravest people I've ever seen. But I got back from India and I completely hit the wall. I was the depression of seeing a country where life was that hard really sent me into a tailspin of depression and into atheism of like, how could this exist in the world? And to get happy, I started hitchhiking. And that was great because you only meet nice people mostly when you're hitchhiking. Only the nice people stop. People in rich cars never stop. Never did a nice car stop for me, not one time. Not to surprise anybody. But then I traveled for about 5 or 10 years on the road, and eventually came back to New York. And there I met my godmother, and she had a spiritual community in upstate New York, and I started learning from them. And it is a monotheistic African diaspora religion. And already my faith had been growing again. And instead of going from the top down and believing in God, it was working my way up. It was starting to believe in these forces of nature as personified. My first one was Mother Earth, and that was thanks to mushrooms. You know, as an atheistic scientist who probably never would have been that outward thinking, not to surprise you again, these mushrooms really helped open me up. And the first deity I discovered on my own was mushrooms. And the first spirit animal helper was the greyhound, because that was the bus I was in when I had a very intense experience with our favorite plant that was way too much, but I felt like the helper spirit of that greyhound, and has been with me ever since. And I started adding on more spirits and forces of nature, and more it felt like they were all adding up to something. The spirit of the ocean, the spirit of flowing water, the spirit of iron, the spirit of the wind, the spirit of fire. And with this religion, it really finally became clear that all of these join together into something. And so now what I believe is that there is this oneness that is far above our understanding. And I don't worry about it too much. Keter on the tree of life is way up here. The abyss of human knowledge is right here. We don't really get to understand 1, 2, and 3. And so I try to grok whatever it is that God is, but I also don't worry about it that much. My job is to be good to my kids and to my partner and to the people in my life. And all of this stuff should be working towards that, and learning things that will help with that. And so it was a very gradual process that brought me back to this monotheism. And so that's basically where I'm at now. I see a oneness and all of these other entities emanating out of that. Now, this video is already so long that I'm sure no one's going to see it anymore, but the refutation of C.S. Lewis is actually quite simple, because this proof is so widespread. You have very famous scientists like Francis Collins and other philosophers who, like Lewis, were backed into a corner philosophically by the same argument, thinking that this must be the proof of God. And C.S. Lewis was one of the best ones to explain it. And he said, and he had a whole series of proofs, but the first step in the proof was because we have an innate sense of goodness in us, that pretty much anyone born would say it's wrong to harm a child, it's wrong to do certain things. And because we all share that, that is that divine spark in us, and it hints at there being some being that emanates from. But to anyone who's ever even glanced at sociobiology, that doesn't make any sense. It made no sense to me in college. I immediately saw this as the obvious hole in it because altruism makes sense evolutionarily. When you are an animal that lives in groups and you are animals that have memory, which is most animals, whether you be oxen or monkeys or whatever, or barnacles, if you help somebody else out, they will remember that and they will pay you back later. It makes sense to give in the wild. Altruism is something that's widely studied, and yes, it is somewhat mysterious, but altruism occurs widely because it gives an evolutionary advantage. So we believe it's wrong to do all of these things because those things aren't in our best interest as humans. And so our genes have molded us against those behaviors. So it does not have to be an innate sense of the divinity. Maybe that is where it's coming from, but you cannot give that as a proof. And so one of the greatest arguments for the existence of God, I think, is resting on rubbish. And I don't think you need a proof. I think you experience this divinity or you don't. And I'm not too worried about people who agree with me or not. I more worry about what you think about how to actually take care of things on this planet right now. That's where we can agree. Whether you believe in this divinity stuff doesn't matter. How do you treat people who are different than you? That is one of the most important things. And so there are some of my long thoughts about the divinity. Feel free to chime in with questions or your own thoughts.